I was on my way home late one night and I decided to stop at this little convenience store just a block from my apartment. You know the kind. The kind of place that's a little run down but always open when you need it. I'd never been inside before, but I had this craving for something salty, and it was the only shop still lit up at that hour. The bell above the door jingled as I walked in, and I immediately felt weird. It was hard to explain. The place smelled off, like wet cardboard and something faintly metallic. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed louder than normal, flickering every few seconds, and the aisles were completely empty. No other customers. I grabbed a bag of chips and a soda from one of those coolers that hum like an old machine struggling to stay alive. As I walked to the counter, I realized there was no one standing there. The register was open, but the stool behind it was empty. I figured maybe the cashier had gone to the back for a second, so I rang the little bell on the counter. "Hello?" I called out, glancing around. Nothing. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. No music, no hum of traffic outside, not even the distant creak of the building settling. Just me, standing there with my chips and soda and feeling like an idiot for expecting good service at midnight. Then I heard it, a noise coming from the back of the store. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe a raccoon messing around, but it wasn't that. It was this wet, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Hello? Is someone there? My voice sounded small, even to me. The noise stopped. I froze, staring at the swinging door that led to the storage room. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I heard it again. This time, louder. It was mixed with something else, like whispers, but I couldn't make out the words. I told myself to just leave, put the snacks down and walk out, but instead, I leaned over the counter, trying to see through the little window in the swinging door. There was something back there, a shape, but the glass was frosted and I couldn't tell what it was. "Hey, I just need to pay," I said louder this time, hoping whoever was back there would come out. Still nothing. The dragging sound came closer. It wasn't coming from behind the door anymore, it was in the aisles. I spun around and my heart dropped. One of the aisles, the one I just walked through, was completely dark now. The light above it had gone out. That was when I saw movement, a flicker of something in the shadows. I stared, my mouth dry, as a shape stepped into the faint glow of the next aisle's light. At first, I thought it was the cashier, maybe playing some kind of weird joke, but it wasn't. It was too tall, its limbs too long, and its head tilted at an angle that no human neck could manage. It wasn't walking, it was dragging itself forward, one arm reaching out, the other pulling something behind it. And, in the dim light, I realized what it was dragging. A man. He was limp, his shirt stained dark, and his head lolled as the creature pulled him closer. I stumbled backward, knocking into the counter. The sound made the creature stop. It snapped its head toward me, and for a second, we just stared at each other. Its face, or what I think was its face, was a mess of slashes and slits that opened and closed, like it was sniffing the air. Then it dropped the body. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted for the door, the bell jingling frantically as I shoved it open. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I ran all the way to my apartment, my heart pounding so hard I thought I'd collapse. When I got inside, I locked the door and pressed my back against it, waiting for my breathing to slow. Only then did I notice I was still clutching the bag of chips. I don't know what that thing was. I don't know what happened to the cashier or the guy it was dragging, but every time I pass that store now, it's dark. The windows boarded up, like it's been abandoned for years. And I swear, sometimes I hear that dragging noise again. But I'm never going back to find out. I'm writing this with trembling hands, knowing it's probably my last chance to share what happened. No one should ever attempt what we did. Going beyond the safe limits of the ocean isn't bravery, it's madness. I'm a marine biologist, and for as long as I can remember, I've been obsessed with the mysteries of the deep sea. When I was invited to join the Abyssal Descent Expedition, I thought it was a dream come true. I'd finally get to witness the unseen depths of the Mariana Trench, the furthest humanity had ever ventured. My partner Elena shared my enthusiasm. She was the pilot, calm under pressure, and more experienced with these depths than anyone else. Together, we were a perfect team. Ready to make history? Elena grinned as we climbed into the Siren, our state-of-the-art submersible. Absolutely, I replied, masking my nerves. The dive started smoothly. As we descended, the sunlight faded until there was nothing but inky blackness around us. The only illumination came from our floodlights, which revealed an alien world of glowing jellyfish and strange skeletal fish. 2 hours in, we reached 10,000 meters, deeper than I'd ever been. The pressure outside was unimaginable, and every creak of the sub made my chest tighten. Elena, do you see that? I asked, pointing to the sonar display. She frowned. Yeah, something's moving down here. The sonar was picking up large, slow-moving objects. They were far apart, but massive, each bigger than a blue whale. I thought nothing this big could survive at these depths, I muttered. That's what they always say, Elena replied, her tone uneasy. Let's keep going. The trench floor isn't far. As we descended further, the eerie calm of the deep was shattered by a low, resonating hum. It wasn't mechanical. It sounded alive, like a deep, guttural whale song, but far more unsettling. Are we picking that up, or is it coming through the hull? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It's both, Elena said, her hands tightening on the controls. I've never heard anything like this. The hum grew louder as we approached the trench floor. Then, our floodlights hit something unexpected, an enormous structure rising out of the sediment. It looked ancient, covered in coral and strange bioluminescent organisms. It's a building? Elena breathed, incredulous. It can't be, I replied, but I couldn't deny what I was seeing. The structure had arches, spires, and carvings, intricate designs that resembled no human civilization I knew of. Elena, we need to report this and... Bang. The sub lurched violently, throwing us against our seats. I scrambled to check the external cameras, and what I saw chilled me to my core. A massive, serpentine creature circled the sub, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Its scales were black and reflective, like polished obsidian, and its mouth was lined with rows of needle-like teeth. Is that not possible? Elena cut me off, flipping switches to stabilize the sub. Hold on. The creature rammed us again, and alarms blared as cracks formed in the viewing dome. We can't stay here, I yelled, panic setting in. Elena pushed the engines to full power, but the creature wasn't letting us go. It coiled around the sub, squeezing, and the sound of metal groaning under the pressure was deafening. Then the humming returned, louder than ever. "Elena, what is that?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the structure outside, where a faint, pulsating light had appeared at the top of one of the spires. The creature suddenly released us and swam toward the structure, as if answering a call. "We need to leave, now!" Elena shouted, but as she turned the sub, the light intensified, flooding the cabin with a blinding brilliance. When the light faded, the structure and the creature were gone. The trench floor was empty, as if they had never been there. "Elena, what just happened?" I asked, but she didn't respond. I turned to her and froze. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her face was pale, as if all the life had drained from her. "Elena!" I reached out, but the moment I touched her, she screamed, a sound so piercing and inhuman that it echoed in my skull. I don't remember how I got back to the surface. The next thing I knew, I was floating in the sub, alone with no sign of Elena. The crew pulled me out, but I couldn't explain what had happened. I've been hearing that hum ever since. It's getting louder. I think it's calling me back. The light intensified, flooding the cabin with a blinding glow. For a moment, I couldn't see anything. The hum turned into a deafening roar, vibrating through every bone in my body. When my vision cleared, the creature was gone. But so was the trench. Or rather, we weren't in the trench anymore. "Elena, what just happened?" I asked, but she was staring ahead, her face pale. I turned to look, and my stomach dropped. The sub was floating in what looked like an endless void, surrounded by countless structures similar to the one we'd seen before. They stretched in every direction, glowing faintly, like a city built on nothingness. But it wasn't just the city. Shapes were moving between the buildings, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They resembled the creature that attacked us, but were even larger, their glowing eyes fixed on us. "Elena, we need to," I started, but she wasn't listening. She was transfixed by something outside the window. I followed her gaze and saw it, a colossal figure rising from the depths below. Its form was impossible to comprehend, like it was shifting between states of existence. Tentacles, eyes, and jaws appeared and disappeared in a swirling mass. The humming returned, this time inside my head, overwhelming my thoughts. Images flooded my mind, visions of the city, its inhabitants, and something ancient buried deeper than we could imagine. "It's calling us," Elena whispered, her voice distant. "Now we have to go," I shouted, grabbing the controls. But it was too late. The figure extended a tendril toward the sub, and as it touched the hole, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back on the surface, floating in the life raft. The sub was gone, and so was Elena. I don't know how I survived, but I wish I hadn't. The humming never stopped. It's still in my head, growing louder every day. If you're reading this, don't go looking for the trench. Some things were meant to stay hidden, buried in the abyss, where even light fears to tread. I can hear them now, coming for me, and soon they'll come for you. After my divorce, I needed a fresh start. Living in motels wasn't cutting it anymore, and when I found an ad for a room in an old Victorian house, it seemed perfect. The price was cheap, and the pictures made the place look like something out of a classic novel. I called immediately. The house was even more impressive in person. It loomed over the street like a relic of another time, with its wraparound porch and ivy-covered walls. As I pulled into the driveway, I felt like I'd stepped back into the 19th century. "Welcome," said Mrs. Weatherby, the landlady, when she opened the front door. She was older, with neatly pinned silver hair and an air of no-nonsense charm. "You'll love it here. The house is quiet, just what you need, I imagine." I nodded, following her inside. The air was cool and smelled of aged wood, lavender, and something faintly metallic. The staircase was grand, the walls lined with portraits of severe-looking people whose eyes seemed to follow me as I passed. "This way," she said, leading me to my room at the very end of the hall. It was small but charming, with antique furniture and a window that overlooked the garden. "Now, one thing," she said, her tone growing serious. "The door across the hall, it's locked. And it's to stay that way. Do you understand?" I blinked, caught off guard. Sure, no problem." Her face softened into a polite smile, but something in her eyes stayed sharp. "Good. Let me know if you need anything." First night was uneventful. I unpacked, read for a while, and fell asleep to the occasional creaks and groans of the old house. It was peaceful in a way, but something about the house felt heavy, as if it was watching me. By the second night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was brushing my teeth when I heard soft footsteps outside my room. They were light, hesitant, stopping just outside my door. I froze, toothbrush in hand, and listened. "Hello?" I called, stepping into the hall. There was no one there. My eyes drifted to the door across the hall, the one she'd told me not to open. It looked ordinary, like every other door in the house, but somehow it felt different, darker, heavier. I shook off the unease and went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The third night, I woke up to a tapping sound. At first, I thought it was branches against my window, but the more I listened, the more I realized it was coming from inside the house, from the door across the hall. I sat up, heart pounding. It wasn't just tapping anymore. It was like someone was gently knocking, as though they were trying to be polite, but couldn't wait much longer. "Mrs. Weatherby?" I called, stepping into the hallway. No answer. The house was unnervedly still, and the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. My curiosity got the better of me. I crossed a hall and reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a moment before turning it. It was unlocked. The room inside was small and dusty, with a single chair facing the window. A man sat in it, his back to me, dressed in tattered old-fashioned clothes. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped, as if he were asleep. "Sir?" I whispered, stepping closer. His head twitched, then slowly lifted. When he turned to face me, I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. His face was wrong. Sunken eyes stared out of a pallid, hollow face, and his mouth hung open as though mid-scream, but no sound came out. He didn't look alive. And then he stood up. I shouldn't be here," I stammered, stepping backward. But before I could turn to run, the door slammed shut behind me and the room went dark. The room inside was small and dusty, with a single chair facing the window. A man sat in it, his back to me. He was dressed in tattered clothes that looked decades, maybe centuries old. "Sir," I whispered, my voice shaky. He didn't move. I stepped closer, my heart thundering in my chest. The air felt heavier with every step. and a faint, metallic smell grew stronger. I reached out a hand, hesitant, but as I got closer, his head jerked up and I froze. Slowly, his head tilted far, too far for anything human. When he turned to face me, my stomach dropped. His eyes were gone. Just hollow, dark pits stared back at me. His mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, his teeth jagged and blackened. "You shouldn't have come here," he hissed, his voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. He rose from the chair, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. "I'm sorry," I choked out, backing toward the door. The man, or whatever he was, took a step toward me, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. "I waited so long," he rasped, "so long for someone to listen. You can't leave now." The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in the small room. I turned and yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The air felt colder, and I could hear faint whispers, like dozens of voices overlapping, growing louder and louder. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. The man was inches away now. His hands, clawed, bony, reached out for me. As they touched my arm, a searing pain shot through me, and the room went black. I woke up in my room, gasping for air. The morning light streamed through the window, and everything seemed normal. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But when I looked at my arm, I saw it. 4 deep, blackened marks where his fingers had gripped me. I packed my things and left that day. Mrs. Weatherby didn't try to stop me, but as I drove away, I caught a glimpse of her standing on the porch, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. I don't know what happened in that house or what that thing in the room was, but sometimes, late at night, I hear faint tapping at my bedroom door, and I'm too afraid to look. They say you don't choose to face the darkness, it chooses you. I learned this the hard way. My life was mundane, predictable, a crumbling old apartment, a dead-end job, and endless nights spent alone. I found solace in thinking, pondering the big questions that most people are too afraid to ask. What comes after we die? Are our beliefs just stories we tell ourselves to endure the silence of the universe? Is death the end, or is there something waiting for us? At first, it was a hobby, a way to pass the time. I read books on near-death experiences, ghost stories, and obscure religious philosophies. Then I found the text. It was tucked away in a dusty corner of an online forum, scanned pages from an old occult manuscript written in a language I couldn't identify. Something about it drew me in. The strange symbols, the alien script that seemed to shift under my gaze. The title translated roughly to The Whispering Gate. It promised knowledge, not vague platitudes or comforting lies, but real, tangible answers about the unknown. I couldn't resist. The rituals were simple enough. Recite the passages aloud. Focus on the questions that plagued you most. Light a single candle and sit in silence. It sounded like harmless theatrics, a game for the desperate or the curious. I started the ritual out of boredom. Night after night, I repeated the same phrases, my voice echoing softly in the dim glow of the candle. Nothing happened at first, and I almost gave up. But then, one night, something changed. The air grew heavy, oppressive. My candle flickered, the flames stretching unnaturally high before shrinking back. A faint rustling sound filled the room, like dry leaves scraping against the walls. I froze, straining to hear. Then came the whispers. Low and guttural, they rose from the shadows around me, dozens of voices, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt them, like icy fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I told myself it was just my imagination, but when the whispers formed into a single voice, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in my chest, I knew this was no trick of the mind. "What do you call?" I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight, my voice trapped in my chest. The candlelight flared, casting monstrous shadows on the walls. "You seek the truth," the voice continued. "You want to know what lies beyond, but every truth has a price." A figure began to emerge from the corner of the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its face was a void, but its eyes, two burning embers, pierced through me, seeing every thought, every fear. "You must choose," it rasped. "The good and the bad and the worse. The answers you crave or the safety of ignorance." I should have stopped then. I should have shut the book, blown out the candle, and run. But I didn't. I couldn't. "I want to know," I whispered, barely able to form the words. Its laughter filled the room, a sound that made my skin crawl. "Then open your eyes," it said, stepping closer. Its shadow consumed everything, swallowing the light, the walls, the floor. And I did. There are no words to describe what I saw. Fragments come back to me in flashes, like jagged shards of glass slicing into my mind. An infinite void stretched out before me, filled with writhing forms, their shapes shifting in ways that defied logic. Their faces, if they could be called that, were twisted into expressions of eternal torment, their mouths open in soundless screams. The air, or whatever passed for it, was alive with motion, a swirling chaos of colors and shadows that made my head throb. I saw chains of light binding entire galaxies, their brilliance flickering like dying stars. I saw figures, monstrous and divine, towering over worlds and tearing them apart with casual indifference. And then there was the darkness. It wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence, an entity that pressed against me, threatening to swallow me whole. It whispered to me, its voice like oil dripping into my ears. "This is what you sought," it said, "the truth of existence, the endless cycle of creation and decay. Life is a fleeting flicker in the vastness, a cruel joke played by forces you cannot comprehend." I tried to look away, but there was no escape. The more I saw, the more I felt myself unraveling. My thoughts splintered, my sense of self crumbling under the weight of the knowledge forced upon me. When I woke, I was on the floor of my apartment. The candle was a puddle of wax, the manuscript gone. The whispers were silent, but something lingered. I can feel it even now, watching me from the corners of the room. It's always there, a shadow that moves when it shouldn't. It doesn't speak, but I know what it wants. I made my choice. I asked for the truth, and I got it. But the price was far greater than I ever imagined. The worst part? I don't think it's done with me yet. "This place is perfect," I said, my voice filled with excitement. "I know, right?" Emily replied, grinning. "I can't believe we found it, our first house." We had just purchased a small, isolated cottage in a forgotten corner of the countryside, far from the hustle of city life. The price was too good to pass up, especially considering the home's age and its unfortunate history. Everyone in the nearby town had whispered about the place for years. Some said it was haunted, others claimed it was cursed. They talked about a man named Victor Reed, who had lived here long ago. Victor was known for his strange hobbies, and it was rumored that he had been involved in dark, unspeakable acts in the very walls of this house. He disappeared without a trace, and no one had heard from him again. It didn't matter to us, though. We didn't believe in ghosts or curses. It was the perfect fixer-upper, and we couldn't wait to start making it our own. The first few weeks were blissful. We spent our days working on renovations, painting walls, and moving furniture into place. The house was full of potential. Cracky floors, peeling wallpaper, but we saw it all as a canvas, waiting to be transformed. But there was something off about the house, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. At first, it was small things. Shadows in the corner of my eye, creaks that seemed to come from places the house shouldn't creak. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, as everyone had said. But even as we unpacked boxes and everyone had said that, an ease settled over me, creeping in like the chill of a fog. It started with a sound. Late one night, I was in the living room reading a book by the dim light of a lamp when I heard it. A soft tapping noise, barely audible at first, like the sound of someone gently knocking on wood. At first, I thought it was the wind outside, or maybe the house shifting, but the sound continued, persistent and rhythmic, as if someone was deliberately tapping on the walls. My heart began to race. I stood up and listened, holding my breath, straining to hear. The noise came from the far corner of the room, near the old cracked wall that separated the living room from the kitchen. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the house settling, it was knocking. Someone or something was knocking from inside the wall. "Emily," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. She appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "What's wrong?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "I swear I hear knocking. It's coming from the walls." Emily smiled, her expression soft and reassuring. "You're probably just imagining things. You've been working too hard, that's all. Maybe you just need to rest." I wanted to believe her, I really did, but deep down, I knew what I'd heard. It wasn't my imagination. The following night, the knocking returned. This time, I was lying in bed, drifting in and out of sleep, when I heard it again. It was louder now, echoing through the house, coming from beneath the floorboards, as though someone was tapping beneath my feet. The noise was deliberate, almost like it was trying to get my attention. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned to Emily, who was still sleeping peacefully beside me. "Emily," I whispered urgently, shaking her arm. She stirred, but didn't wake. I called out her name again, louder this time, and she finally opened her eyes, blinking in confusion. "What is it?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "The knocking, it's back," I said, my voice rising with panic. Emily groggily rubbed her eyes and rolled over. "It's probably nothing, just an old house settling. Go back to sleep." I tried to calm myself, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic knocking that seemed to grow louder as the night wore on. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. It was something or someone trying to get in. The next morning, I was barely awake, the lack of sleep wearing on me. Emily was already in the kitchen making coffee when I stumbled in, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Good morning," she said, offering me a cup of coffee. "You look like you haven't slept a wink." "I haven't," I replied, my voice tight. "The knocking kept me up all night." Emily frowned, her expression softening with concern. "Okay, I'll check it out today, I promise. After breakfast." I nodded but couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. As I sipped my coffee, I tried to focus on the day ahead, but my mind kept drifting back to the knocking. What could it be? What was trying to get in? I tried to brush it off, but the feeling that something was terribly wrong wouldn't let me go. Emily went outside to inspect the foundation and the walls, checking for any signs of damage or creatures that might be causing the noises. I stayed inside, pacing, trying to distract myself by cleaning the kitchen. The silence felt suffocating, and every creak of the house seemed amplified. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. When Emily came back inside, she looked at me with an unreadable expression. "I checked everything. There's no sign of anything unusual," she said. Her voice was calm, but I could tell she was trying to reassure me more than herself. I nodded, trying to push the doubt out of my mind, but deep down, I wasn't convinced. I wasn't sure if I believed her or if she was trying to convince herself. There was something wrong with this house, something dark and hidden beneath its walls. That night, as we settled in for bed, the knocking returned. Louder this time, almost frantic, as though it was desperate for us to hear it. I clutched the covers, my heart racing in my chest. Emily was already asleep, but I could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just the house settling anymore. It was something else. "Emily," I whispered, but she didn't stir. I was left in the darkness, alone with the sound that haunted me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something under the house, and it was waiting. Heavy with exhaustion. "Good morning," Emily said, offering me a cup of coffee. "You look like you haven't slept a wink." I haven't," I replied, my voice tight. "The knocking kept me up all night." Emily frowned, setting the coffee down. "Are you sure? Maybe it was just a dream. You've been really stressed with the house. Maybe you need to rest." But I knew it wasn't a dream. The sound had been too real, too deliberate. I could still hear it in my mind, that rhythmic tapping echoing through the walls. "I swear, Emily, it wasn't a dream. I know what I heard," I said, my voice growing more desperate. "It came from the walls, the floor. It was like someone was trying to get out." Emily studied me for a moment, her expression softening. Okay, let's just take a breath. I'll check things out today. After breakfast, we'll look around. Maybe it's just the house settling or some pipes under the floor. We'll get to the bottom of it." I nodded, trying to push down the unease gnawing at me. But I wasn't convinced. That tapping wasn't natural. I had lived in enough old houses to know the difference between a house settling and something else. After breakfast, Emily went outside to inspect the foundation. I stayed behind, pacing nervously inside. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified, every sound from the old beams echoing through the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was watching, listening. When Emily returned inside, her expression was unreadable. I checked everything. No signs of anything unusual," she said, her tone a little too casual. "I think it's just an old house doing its thing. We're fine." But I could see the doubt in her eyes. She wasn't convinced either, but she wasn't saying it out loud. The next few days were more of the same. The knocking never stopped. It was louder now, relentless. It felt as though it was getting closer, as if something or someone was beneath the house, trying to get through the floors, the walls. I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. At night, I would lay awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, waiting for the tapping to return. Then, one evening, Emily was down in the basement, working on some electrical repairs. I was upstairs cleaning the kitchen when I heard it again. The knocking. This time, not from the walls, not from the floor. It was coming from beneath the basement, a rhythmic pounding, echoing through the pipes. My heart skipped. I rushed to the basement door and opened it, calling down, "Emily," I shouted, "did you hear that?" There was no response. I called her name again, louder this time, but still nothing. My heart hammered in my chest. There was something terribly wrong. I hesitated for a moment, then rushed down the stairs into the basement, my breath shallow, my skin prickling with cold dread. The knocking grew louder, faster, as if something was trying to break through from beneath the floor. I reached the bottom of the stairs and froze. Emily wasn't there. She wasn't anywhere. The basement was empty, except for the old pipes and the dim light hanging above. But the sound, oh, the sound. It was louder than ever now. It wasn't coming from the walls. It wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from beneath the earth itself. "Emily!" I screamed, panic rising in my chest. Just as I was about to turn and rush back upstairs, I heard a soft voice, Emily's voice, calling from somewhere deep within the house, from below, from the dirt itself. "Jess, help me." I froze. My blood ran cold. "Emily?" I whispered, fear choking my words. "Where are you?" The knocking stopped. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Then I felt a cold breath on my neck. I spun around, but no one was there. The air was thick, and the walls seemed to close in around me. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but I couldn't move, rooted to the spot. Something was beneath this house, something old, something that shouldn't be here. Then I heard it again, the knocking, but this time it wasn't just a sound, it was a voice, a low, guttural whisper rising from the floorboards, from the very earth beneath my feet. "Join us." The floor beneath me groaned, and a heavy, dark shadow seemed to rise from the cracks in the foundation. I backed away slowly, my legs shaking, my breath quickening. The whisper grew louder, and with it, the tapping, a thudding sound like a heart beating, a pulse beneath the house. "Emily," I shouted again, my voice breaking. "Where are you?" There was no answer, only the deafening sound of the knocking, relentless, growing. And then I understood. It wasn't a house settling. It wasn't an old pipe. It was something far worse. I turned, desperate to run, but the door behind me slammed shut with a force I couldn't explain. I was trapped, and it was coming for me. Then I heard it again, the knocking. But this time, it wasn't coming from beneath the house. It was coming from inside the walls, just behind me, as if someone or something was trapped inside, pounding to get out. My pulse quickened, my body frozen in terror. I wanted to run, to scream, but the fear was paralyzing. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was trapped inside was trying desperately to escape. Suddenly, the air around me seemed to grow colder. I could see my breath in front of me, despite the warmth of the house. My heart raced in my chest as I turned slowly, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Where are you?" No response, but the knocking? It didn't stop. I took a step back, my hands shaking, and that's when I saw it. A dark shadow in the corner of the basement. It was moving. Slowly at first, but then it began to shift closer. I could see the outline of a figure, tall and thin, but it wasn't human. Its form was twisted, misshapen, as though it had been crawling its way toward me for years. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. It was coming from inside the very walls now, surrounding me, filling every corner of the room. "Emily, please, where are you?" I pleaded, my voice barely a whisper. The shadow in the corner began to take shape, and my breath hitched as I saw it. A face, pale and gaunt, peering out from the darkness. Its eyes were wide open, black as the night, and its mouth stretched into a twisted grin. I stumbled back, gasping for air, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But there it was, right in front of me. The knocking stopped abruptly, silence. Then I heard a voice, soft, haunting, familiar. "Jess," it whispered, "come closer." I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. No, this isn't real." But the figure's voice grew louder, more insistent, almost pleading. "Come closer, Jess. I need you." The shadow shifted again, and now I could see more. Hands, long and twisted, reaching toward me from the darkness. I stumbled backward, my body moving on instinct, but the door to the basement suddenly slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I screamed, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow was getting closer, its hands stretching toward me, its face now inches from mine. I could feel its cold breath on my skin as it whispered again, "Help me." But this time, it wasn't Emily's voice. The voice that came from the darkness was cold, hollow, ancient. It was Victor Reed's voice. Without thinking, I bolted for the stairs, racing up to the kitchen. I slammed my shoulder against the door, throwing it open, but there was no sign of Emily. The house was silent now, as if everything had frozen in place. "Emily," I shouted, panic rising, "where are you?" Oh, there was no answer, but then the knocking started again. It came from upstairs, from behind the walls, from the floors. It was everywhere, all around me, vibrating through the house like a living thing. I ran upstairs, my legs trembling beneath me, and burst into the bedroom. The room was empty, no sign of Emily. But the knocking, it was louder now, almost deafening. I turned to the floor, my eyes scanning the space beneath the bed, and that's when I saw it. A small rusted door in the corner of the room, half hidden behind an old wardrobe. It was the only place I hadn't checked. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming for me to leave, but something deep inside urged me to open it. Something was down there, something that needed to be found. I dropped to my knees, my fingers trembling as I reached for the rusty handle. With a grunt, I pulled the door open. The smell of damp earth and rot filled my nostrils as I peered into the dark space below. And there, in the shadows, I saw her, Emily. Her body curled into a ball, her hands clutching the floorboards as if she were trying to dig her way out. "Emily!" I cried, rushing to her side. But she didn't respond. Her face was pale, her eyes wide open, but there was no life in them. She was breathing, but it was shallow, slow. "Emily, please, wake up," I begged, shaking her. But then I heard it again, the voice, deep and guttural, whispered from the dark corner beneath the floor. "She's mine now." I looked down at Emily, but her eyes didn't meet mine. Instead, they stared vacantly, and her mouth twisted into a grin, an unnatural, sinister grin. "No," I whispered, realizing the truth too late. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but the basement was empty. The knocking, now frantic and furious, surrounded me. And then, in the dark, I heard Victor Reed's voice one last time. "Welcome home." I've always had sleep paralysis. It started when I was a teenager, but it didn't feel like normal sleep paralysis. It felt different. It wasn't just the inability to move or the weight on my chest. No, it was worse than that. Every time I woke up and couldn't move, there was something else there with me. At first, it was small things, a shadow in the corner of my room, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I tried to dismiss it as my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. When I couldn't move, I felt trapped, completely at the mercy of whatever presence was lurking just out of sight. I could hear whispers, murmurs in a language I didn't understand. The worst part wasn't even the fear. It was the sensation that the entity was there, watching me, waiting for me to move, to react. Sometimes I'd feel something cold touch my face or crawl up my legs, and that was enough to make me panic. I wanted to scream, to move, to escape, but I couldn't. But then, it started getting worse. It wasn't just at night anymore. I would wake up during the day, sometimes in the middle of a nap, and find myself frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. And that's when it happened. The first time I felt it, a pull. It was as if something was dragging me out of my own body, tugging at my soul, like a rope pulling me into the dark. I remember trying to scream, but my mouth wouldn't work. My body was numb, and I could feel myself slipping away from it. My vision blurred, and everything around me faded into blackness. I felt weightless, like I was falling. When I opened my eyes again, I was in a place that wasn't my room. I was standing, or floating, I'm not sure, somewhere in between. The air was thick, heavier than anything I had ever breathed before. And the light, it wasn't real light. It was a sickly hue, dim and pulsing, like it was alive. I could hear voices, distant at first, but then they started getting louder, chanting, murmuring, calling me. My legs felt like they were being pulled toward the sound. I tried to resist, but it felt like an invisible force was drawing me in, pulling me deeper. The world around me shifted, the ground beneath me becoming soft and unstable. And then I saw them. They were spirits, figures in the shadows, their forms barely discernible, drifting and twisting like smoke. Some had faces, others were just dark silhouettes. Their eyes were black pits, voids that seemed to pull at my very soul. I couldn't look away. They surrounded me, their whispers growing louder and more frantic. They were speaking to me, but I couldn't understand. One of them stepped forward. It was a woman, or at least I thought it was a woman. Her body was thin, elongated, her skin pale as death. She reached out to touch my arm, her fingers ice cold, and for the first time in my life, I felt real terror. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was trapped in this space between worlds, surrounded by these spirits that seemed to be feeding off my fear. They knew my fear. They knew me, and they were taking pleasure in it. I tried to close my eyes, to wake up, but no matter what I did, I couldn't escape. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I was back in my room, lying on my bed, gasping for air. The sweat soaked my sheets, my body shaking uncontrollably. But I knew something had changed. That wasn't a dream. That was real. I didn't know what had happened to me or why it was happening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it had followed me back. After that, I stopped sleeping. I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes, not with the fear that I would slip into that other world again, but eventually, exhaustion caught up with me. One night, I fell asleep, and it was worse than ever before. It wasn't just sleep paralysis anymore. The line between the waking world and the nightmare world had blurred, and I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Every time I fell asleep, it felt like I was pulled into that place again, that dimension between life and death, where the spirits dwelled. This time, the transition was different. It was as if I wasn't just drifting into another realm. I was being ripped from my body, torn from my own mind. The sensation was violent, forceful, as though something or someone was trying to drag me away. I felt my soul stretch, pulling farther and farther from my body, until finally I couldn't tell where I ended and where the darkness began. When my eyes opened again, I was in a vast, endless space. It wasn't dark, but it wasn't light either. It was like the color had been drained from everything. The air felt dense, thick with the weight of something ancient and oppressive. I could hear faint whispers, murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere, yet nowhere at all. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings, but all I saw were endless spirals of swirling mist and shifting shapes. Shadows stretched and twisted around me, their forms indistinct, as though they were constantly in motion. I could feel them watching me, always watching. But there was something else here too, something that wasn't just observing, it was, waiting. I moved forward, unsure of where I was or how to escape, but it didn't matter. I wasn't in control. The spirits were pulling me, urging me forward. The ground beneath me was unstable, as if it wasn't really there, but more like a thin film separating me from an abyss that threatened to swallow me whole. Then I saw them. The figures were much clearer now. Long, twisted shadows with faces that flickered and shifted like flames. They didn't speak, but their intent was clear. They wanted something from me. They wanted my fear. They wanted to consume me. One of them stepped forward, a tall figure, its face a blank mask of twisted anguish. It reached out with long, bony fingers, and as it touched my arm, a cold shock ran through me. A vision flashed in my mind, a place, a scene I didn't recognize, a door heavy and rusted, standing in the middle of an empty void. Beyond it, I could see flashes of movement, of shadows that seemed to watch, waiting. The figure's voice was a rasp, a whisper, but it was louder than all the other spirits combined. "Do you want to know what lies beyond?" it hissed. "Do you want to see what you're truly a part of?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The terror clawing at my chest had paralyzed me. But I didn't need to say anything. The figure knew. It knew I was terrified. And that's when it happened. The world around me began to distort. The air grew thick with something dark, suffocating. The ground beneath me seemed to disappear, and the mist swirled into an endless void. I felt myself falling, through the mist, through the blackness, through something far older than I could comprehend. The whispers grew louder, their voices now a cacophony of screams, of agonizing, tortured souls. I landed hard on something cold and slick, my body aching from the impact. But as I rose to my feet, I saw it. The door. It was standing in the middle of the void, just as the figure had shown me. Rusted and ancient, its surface covered in cryptic symbols that twisted and shifted as if alive. I could hear the sound of breathing from behind it, slow, steady, like something waiting to feast. I stepped forward, compelled by an unseen force, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked as it slowly opened, revealing the darkness beyond. But it wasn't just emptiness that lay beyond that threshold. There was a figure there, a shadow within the darkness, a face, if you could even call it that. A mouth, wide and gaping, filled with rows upon rows of jagged teeth. It grinned at me, a grin that made my skin crawl. "Welcome," it said, the voice deep and rumbling, like the ground itself was speaking. "You've come to claim what you've always been. You've been one of us all along." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached forward, its hand moving in the air like it was drawing me in, pulling me toward the void. But then everything stopped. I woke up, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My heart was racing, my body trembling. I was back in my room, safe. Or so I thought. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me as I tried to steady my breathing. Something had changed. I wasn't sure what, but I knew I wasn't alone. And that's when I saw it, standing in the corner of my room, a shadow darker than the rest. It wasn't just a shadow of a person. No, it was the thing I had encountered in that other world. It was waiting. The spirits hadn't let me go. They had only shown me a glimpse of what lay beyond. And now, they were coming for me. I tried to move, to scream, to wake up, but it was too late. I had already crossed the threshold, and there was no turning back. I had always been curious about the stories, the ones about people who claim to experience something beyond our world after taking DMT. They spoke of visions, of seeing the fabric of existence unravel, of encountering beings that felt more real than anything in this life. It sounded too bizarre to be true, but the allure of it lingered in my mind. I wanted to know what it felt like to break through, to see the world through a different lens, to touch something other. So, when a friend of mine, Alex, told me that I had to try it, that it would be life-changing, I couldn't resist. He said, "You're going to understand reality in a way you never have before. You'll meet entities, beings that exist outside of time and space. It's transcendental." At the time, I didn't understand how deeply those words would haunt me. The night I decided to try it, everything was set up. Dim lights, soft music, and Alex beside me, encouraging me to let go of any expectations. "Just let it happen," he said, his eyes wide with anticipation. I took the vapor, inhaled deeply, and exhaled slowly. The effects didn't hit immediately, but soon enough, the world around me started to shift. The walls of the room seemed to breathe, pulsing with a strange energy. The air felt thick, almost electric, and the sound of my heartbeat became deafening in my ears. I closed my eyes, expecting the usual rush of color, the visual distortions, but this was different. I felt weightless. It wasn't a physical sensation. No, it was as if my mind had detached from my body completely. I was floating in a vast, infinite space, suspended in something that felt both alive and ancient. The world I knew was gone, replaced by something far more real, far more intense. Every thought, every sensation felt amplified, as if I had entered a higher plane of existence. And then they appeared. Entities, or at least that's what I thought they were. They didn't have human forms, but they were intelligent. More than that, aware. Their shapes shifted, constantly changing, morphing from one thing to another. Faces that were like masks, eyes that held infinite depths, and voices that echoed without sound. Everything about them was unsettling, but also fascinating. There was one in particular, an entity that seemed to stand out from the rest. It was tall, shadowy, with glowing violet eyes that locked onto mine as if it knew me. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't just observing me, it was waiting for me. I didn't understand how, but I could feel it pulling me closer, as if it was calling me home. My thoughts scrambled in a panic, but then it spoke, and its voice was inside my mind, soothing yet chilling. "You've always been here," it said. "We have always known you. You are a part of us." I tried to pull away, but I couldn't. I was trapped in this state of heightened existence. The being began to draw nearer, its presence overwhelming me. It reached out, not physically, but energetically, and I felt a rush of emotions flood my consciousness. Longing, desire, a connection that felt more intimate than anything I had ever known in this life. I could hear my own thoughts screaming, begging me to wake up, to get out of this trance before it consumed me entirely. But the entity's gaze held me firm, and I couldn't resist. And then, just as suddenly as it began, I felt the world around me start to unravel. The swirling mist of this otherworldly plane began to fade, and the room I was sitting in returned to focus. But something felt off. I was back in my body, but it wasn't the same. The air felt thicker, heavier. The colors in the room seemed dimmer, less real, and I could still feel them, the entities, like they had never left. They lingered at the edges of my perception, waiting. Alex was sitting next to me, his face full of wonder, as if nothing had changed. "What was that like for you?" he asked, his voice almost reverent. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could speak, a chill ran down my spine. There, standing in the corner of the room, was the entity, the one with the violet eyes. It was no longer in the ethereal plane. It was here, in my world, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, convinced that I was hallucinating, but when I opened them again, it was still there, watching me. Alex turned around, but saw nothing. "Everything okay?" he asked, clearly unaware of the cold presence in the room. I nodded, forcing a smile, though the terror was rising in my chest. It followed me. I wasn't sure how or why, but that entity was now in my world. As I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of my mind, the entity took a step forward. The room grew colder, and I could see its form more clearly now. Its long, shadowy limbs twisting unnaturally, the violet eyes still locked on mine, filled with something I couldn't describe, but it wasn't anger. No, it was something else. And then, just before my mind could make sense of it, I heard it, the voice, deep and resonant, reverberating through my thoughts. "I am here, now, and I am yours." I froze, my words dying in my throat. There, standing in the corner of the room, was the same entity. Its violet eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just an after-image from the trip. It was real, or at least it felt real. My breath caught in my chest, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from its gaze. Alex didn't seem to notice it, still lost in his own thoughts, as if everything was perfectly normal. But I knew it wasn't. This wasn't just some hallucination, not some side effect of the DMT. It was here, and it wasn't alone. I blinked, and when I looked back, I saw more figures, shadows standing in the corners of the room, their forms shifting in and out of existence. There was an oppressive weight in the air now, like the room itself was closing in on me. My heart began to race. I stood up, my legs unsteady, feeling as if the ground beneath me might disappear at any moment. "Alex," I whispered, but my voice barely escaped my throat. "Do you see them? The figures? The entities?" Alex looked at me, confused. "What figures?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "You're just coming down, man. You're probably still tripping." But I knew what I was seeing was real. The entity in the corner stepped forward, its form flickering like a shadow caught in a flickering light. It moved closer, its presence overwhelming, and I felt a sudden rush of fear mixed with something else, something that made my skin tingle. It was fascinated by me, like it had discovered something it couldn't resist. "You don't belong here anymore," it said, its voice thick with an unnatural resonance. "You've crossed over. You are ours now." I staggered back, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't what I had expected. I thought the trip would end with a feeling of enlightenment, of insight, of transcendence. But this was something darker, something far more dangerous. The entity's form shifted again, becoming more defined, more solid. It was no longer a mere presence, but a being of palpable substance. Its body still translucent, but it exuded a raw energy that made the room feel colder. The others followed suit, materializing around it. They circled me, closing in. "What do you hear?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "We are here because you called us," it responded, the words echoing in my mind. "You invited us, you opened the door, and now you must pay the price." I could feel its presence, suffocating and intimate. There was no escape. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move, my body paralyzed by the weight of their gaze. Suddenly, one of them, the entity that had been the most drawn to me, stepped forward. Its form was different now, Less shadow, more flesh, or what looked like flesh. Its face was like a mask, twisted in an expression of longing and hunger. It reached out, its cold fingers brushing my arm, sending a jolt of electricity through my body. "I've waited for you," it said, its voice barely a whisper. "You are mine." And then something in me snapped. I pulled away, heart racing, adrenaline surging. In an instant, I was no longer in control of my actions. I turned, sprinting out of the room, bursting through the door with everything I had. I could hear them behind me, their whispers following me like an unholy chant. I ran down the hallway, my breath ragged, desperate for an escape. But the air felt thick, almost gelatinous, like I was running through molasses. The shadows clung to the walls, stretching toward me, reaching for me. It was as if the house itself had become a conduit to this other dimension, a place that no longer adhered to the rules of physics or time. I could feel their hands on my back, icy and sharp, pulling me back. I stumbled, crashing to the floor, and when I looked up, I saw her. The entity, the one who had felt attached to me. She was standing in the doorway, her face now fully visible, her features twisted with a mixture of desperation and desire. Her eyes, oh, those violet eyes, glowed, and I felt a pull, a gravitational force that was impossible to resist. You can't leave," she said softly. "You opened the door. You belong to us now, forever." Her voice wasn't just in my ears, it was in my head, in my soul. And for a brief moment, I felt a strange calm, as if I had no choice but to give in. Maybe it would be easier this way, to let her in, to let the entities consume me completely, to join them in that otherworldly existence where nothing made sense but everything felt real. But then, in that moment of weakness, something inside me screamed, "No!" I staggered to my feet, backing away, my heart hammering against my ribs. I ran, faster this time, out into the night air, where I gasped for breath, feeling the cold wind wash over me. But I knew it wasn't over. I knew that they weren't going to stop. As I stood there, shaking and drenched in sweat, I looked back at the house. The windows were dark, but I could feel their presence, watching me, waiting. They were still there, on the other side of the door. And this time, the door wouldn't close. It was supposed to be just a quick road trip, a chance to get out of the city, clear our heads, and have some fun by the lake. The plan was simple: drive through the quiet back roads, stop for gas, grab a bite, and then head to the cabin. But somewhere along the way, I knew we had taken a wrong turn. "Do you think we missed the exit?" Anna asked, glancing at her phone, which had no signal. She looked up at the road ahead, frowning. "We should have seen something by now." "I don't know," Mark muttered from the driver's seat. "I think we're just taking the scenic route, no big deal." But it was starting to feel like a bigger deal the longer we kept driving. The trees got thicker, the air heavier, and the road less traveled. No signs, no other cars, just us on this winding, narrow road that seemed to stretch on forever. I felt a knot in my stomach as the scenery blurred past, an uneasy feeling gnawing at me. "This doesn't feel right," I said, sitting up straighter, looking out the window. "We haven't seen a single sign for miles." Mark just waved it off. "It's fine, we'll find the highway soon, trust me." I wasn't convinced. We kept driving, hoping for a turn, a sign, anything. But what we found instead was something even stranger, a town. A small, forgotten town that didn't appear on any map. It seemed to pop up out of nowhere, rising from the dense woods like a ghostly silhouette. Guys?" I said, my voice tight. "Is this even on the map? Because I don't see anything here." Mark squinted through the windshield, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Nope, there's no town here. It's like we've stumbled off the map entirely." The buildings looked abandoned, like they hadn't been touched in decades. There were no people in sight, no cars, no signs of life. The houses were old, wooden, decaying, their windows boarded up, the streets eerily empty. It was like stepping into a place that time had forgotten, a place that had never been part of the real world. "What the hell is this place?" Anna asked, her voice low. She seemed just as freaked out as I felt. "Maybe we should just turn around," Jess said, her voice shaky. I don't like this." But I couldn't look away. The air felt heavy. The silence was too thick, too unnatural. Something about the town was wrong. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt empty, like no one had lived there for years, like it was stuck in some sort of limbo. Mark shrugged, clearly more adventurous than the rest of us. "We're here now, let's take a quick walk. Maybe we'll find someone who can point us in the right direction." I wasn't so sure, but with no other options, we all reluctantly agreed. We parked near the edge of the town, stepping out into the thick, heavy air. The chill in the air made the back of my neck prickle. I could see my breath, even though it was still technically summer. It was wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. "Let's just make it quick," Anna said, her voice barely audible. We started walking down the street, the old buildings casting long shadows in the fading daylight. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that felt like it was pressing down on you, suffocating you with its weight. There was something strange about the street, too. It looked like no one had touched it in years, but at the same time, the buildings appeared too perfect, as if they were just waiting for something or someone to come back. I glanced at my friends who were walking just ahead of me. Jess kept glancing nervously over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to be standing behind us. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone was watching us. "Where is everybody?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I mean, there should be someone here, right? Mark turned around, his face impassive. "Who knows? Maybe they just packed up and left." I didn't answer, but my unease grew. Something about this place didn't add up. The more I looked, the more I realized that it wasn't just empty. It was as if it was waiting for something. Or someone. We walked further into the town, past the old houses, the peeling paint, the rusty street lights that flickered faintly as if about to die. And then, at the end of the road, I saw something. A building. Larger than the rest, with a faded sign hanging above the door. It looked like it might have been a town hall or a shop, but whatever it had been, it had long since fallen into disrepair. And then I heard it. A soft sound, barely noticeable at first. A faint whisper on the wind, like a murmur from far away. I stopped dead in my tracks. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. My friends didn't hear it, or at least they didn't acknowledge it. They kept walking as if the odd noise was nothing. But to me, it felt like something had changed, like we'd crossed an invisible line. I glanced around. The street seemed even quieter now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And then I saw them. Figures, shadows, standing in the windows of the houses, watching us. Their shapes were indistinct, but there was no mistaking the way they moved, like they were waiting for something, or someone. "Guys," I whispered urgently, there's something looking at us." I turned to run back to the car, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of something, or rather, someone, standing at the end of the street. A figure, too tall, too still, and for a brief moment, just before the figure stepped back into the shadows, it felt like it was smiling at me. And that's when I knew, whatever this town was, whatever had happened here, it wasn't just a ghost town, it was a trap. A trap that we had just walked into. We kept walking, but it felt like the town was closing in on us. The further we went, the more suffocating the silence became. The air seemed thicker, heavier, like something was pressing against my chest. I glanced around, my eyes darting from one old, decaying building to another. It was as if time had been paused here, frozen in place, like a forgotten memory. "Guys, I really don't like this," Jess said, her voice shaky. "Let's just get back to the car and leave." I wanted to agree with her. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, but I couldn't help myself. There was something compelling about the town, a strange pull, like I had to see more. We reached the town square, a crumbling fountain at the center surrounded by statues that were half fallen, their faces worn away by time. The place felt too still. No wind, no birds, not even the sound of leaves rustling. Just silence. And then I heard it. A soft sound, barely a whisper. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it came again. Closer this time, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I froze. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. My heart skipped a beat. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Anna nodded, her eyes wide. "Yeah, it sounded like footsteps." We all stood still, straining to hear over the oppressive quiet, but there was nothing. The footsteps stopped. I let out a shaky breath, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching us. "Let's go back to the car," Anna said, clearly just as spooked as I was. But as we turned to leave, we were stopped by a figure. A man stood at the edge of the square, just barely visible in the shadow of one of the broken-down buildings. He was tall, thin, and dressed in old, ragged clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide and unblinking as they fixed on us. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice cracking. But the man didn't answer. He just stood there watching us. His presence felt suffocating, like he was sucking the life out of everything around him. Are you from around here?" Mark asked, his voice steady, but the tension in his posture was obvious. The man took a slow step forward, his feet making no sound as they met the ground. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath. "We never left," he whispered, his voice hoarse and dry, like it hadn't been used in years. "We never leave." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "What do you mean? What happened to this town?" I asked, my voice trembling. But before the man could answer, a low hum filled the air. It started quietly at first, almost imperceptible. But then it grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. I turned to look at my friends, but they were staring past me, their faces pale and frozen in place. I followed their gaze, and my heart stopped. Figures? No, shadows were starting to appear at the edges of the town, stepping out from the dark corners, emerging from the crumbling buildings like specters from another world. They were all the same, pale, gaunt, their eyes hollow and lifeless, their bodies twisted and deformed. Some of them didn't even have faces, just smooth, empty skin where their faces should have been. "The hell is going on?" Jess whispered, backing away, but the shadows closed in around us, their forms flickering in and out of existence. "We never left," the man repeated, his voice echoing now, as if the words were being spoken by the entire town. "You're not the first to wander in, and you won't be the last." Panic surged through me, my heart hammering in my chest. "We need to get out of here!" I shouted, turning and running back toward the car. But the air had thickened, pressured, and my legs felt as though they were moving through molasses. The shadows were faster than we were, creeping toward us from every direction. I could hear the whispers now. They were coming from everywhere, from the air itself, from the buildings, from the ground beneath me. They were calling our names, pleading with us to stay. The shadows were getting closer. "Run!" I screamed. But the words barely left my lips before I felt a cold hand close around my wrist. I turned to find a shadowy figure standing right in front of me. Its face was a black void, but I could feel its eyes, watching me, waiting for me to do something, anything. I pulled away, my heart racing, and stumbled backward, and that's when I heard the screaming. It wasn't the sound of a person. It was something deeper, something primal and inhuman. The ground beneath us began to tremble, and the shadows surged forward, reaching out to grab us, to drag us into the town's eternal darkness. In that moment, I knew we were trapped. The town wasn't abandoned. It had been waiting for us to wander in, waiting for our curiosity to pull us into its grasp. And now it had us, forever. We tried to run, but the town didn't let us go. The shadows closed in, and I felt myself being pulled into the void. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long I've been here, or if I've even left. The shadows, they never leave, and neither will I. It's funny how excited I was about moving into a new place. The house was older, a little worn down in some places, but it had character. The kind of character you don't get in a new development. My friends said I was crazy for buying it, but something about the old wood floors and the creaky stairs felt right to me. I figured it would be my project, fixing it up, making it my own. But there was one thing I didn't expect to find. It was tucked away in the attic. I had been going through boxes and old furniture, sorting out what to keep and what to throw away, when I saw it, a massive, old-fashioned mirror leaning against the far wall. The frame was ornate, gold with intricate carvings of flowers and vines. It was beautiful in an eerie way, like something that didn't belong in this house. Curious, I dragged it out of the corner, brushing off years of dust and cobwebs. The glass was slightly cloudy, but when I wiped it down, the reflection that stared back at me was sharp enough. It was like one of those mirrors you'd find in an antique store, the kind that seemed to hold a piece of history within them, but something about it felt off. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought it was just an old mirror, one of those things that had a bit of charm. But that night, when I went to brush my teeth before bed, I noticed something strange. As I stood in front of the mirror, brushing away, I caught a glimpse of my reflection. It wasn't exactly like my movements. The reflection didn't look right. It was a split second behind, like it was lagging, but it wasn't just that. It felt wrong. I paused, watching my reflection as I moved my hand up to finish brushing. It did the same, but there was something eerie about it. The reflection didn't look right. It was almost as if it was waiting. I shook the feeling off, thinking I was just being paranoid. It was an old mirror, after all, probably just the way the light hit it or something. But over the next few days, I noticed it happening more and more, my reflection not quite matching me. Sometimes it was just a delay. Other times, it felt like it was doing its own thing. One night, after a long day of unpacking and getting settled in, I went into the bathroom again. I was exhausted, but the mirror caught my eye once more. I looked into it, adjusting my hair, and this time I really stared. My reflection was staring back at me with the same tired expression on my face, but something in its eyes was different. As I shifted my weight, the reflection didn't follow. It was like it had paused, frozen for a moment, and then it moved, slowly, like it was deciding to catch up to me. I frowned, squinting at the mirror, wondering if I was just losing my mind. That's when I felt it. A chill. A cold breeze that seemed to come from nowhere, though the bathroom window was closed. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the open window, but it was shut tight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned back to the mirror, and that's when I saw it. My reflection was grinning. A wide, unsettling grin that wasn't mine. It wasn't just a smile. It was a sneer, like something malicious. It looked like me, but it wasn't. And the worst part? I hadn't moved a muscle. I backed away slowly, eyes still locked on the mirror. The reflection didn't follow me. It stayed there, its eyes never leaving mine, its grin widening. I slammed the bathroom door shut, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't just a weird optical illusion. Something about that mirror. It wasn't right. That night, I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just tired, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to the mirror in the attic, the way it had felt when I first saw it, like it was watching me, waiting for something. And then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it. A sound coming from downstairs, from the direction of the attic, a faint creaking, like something heavy had been moved. I lay there in the dark, holding my breath, trying to make sense of it. The creaking stopped, but the unease didn't. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong with that mirror. I knew I had to go back up to the attic, but part of me was terrified to see it again, to face whatever it was that was waiting for me. I lay still in bed, straining to hear. The house was old, so it creaked and groaned in strange places, but this was different. It wasn't just the usual sounds of settling. It was deliberate, like someone or something was moving. I tried to shake it off, but the unease gnawed at me, pulling me from the warmth of my blankets. The house felt colder now, and that mirror, that damn mirror, lingered in my thoughts like a shadow. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw off the covers and stood up. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I made my way down the hallway toward the attic. The stairs to the attic were narrow and steep, covered in dust and cobwebs. As I reached the top, I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the doorframe. I couldn't explain why, but something inside me screamed not to go up there. But I couldn't resist. I pushed the door open. The attic was dim, lit only by the pale moonlight streaming through a tiny, grime-covered window. The air was thick with a scent of old wood and mildew. I stepped inside, eyes scanning the room. And there it was. The mirror, standing exactly where I had left it. But something was different. It was turned slightly, angled toward the corner of the room as though it had been moved. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I hadn't touched it, not since the night I first saw it. I walked toward it slowly, every step feeling heavier, like I was walking through thick fog. The reflection in the mirror seemed to shimmer, like the glass was rippling. And then I saw it again, the grin. This time it wasn't just a smile, it was a twisted, horrifying expression of glee, wide and knowing, as if it had been waiting for me. I could feel its eyes. No, not my eyes. It was watching me. I reached a trembling hand out toward the mirror. But as my fingers brushed against the surface, a cold shock shot up my arm. I pulled my hand back, heart pounding in my chest. The reflection didn't flinch. It didn't move. But I did. I turned to run, but the room had shifted. The walls were closing in, the shadows stretched and twisted, as if the mirror wasn't just reflecting my image, it was pulling me in. Before I could make it to the stairs, the reflection, it moved. The figure in the mirror grinned wider, and then it stepped forward, out of the mirror. It was me, but not me. My reflection, standing in the room with me, its face contorted with that horrible, knowing smile. I screamed, stumbling back, but the thing reached out, its hand grasping mine with cold, unnatural force. My heart felt like it was going to explode. It didn't let go. It pulled me closer. I could hear my reflection whispering, but the voice wasn't mine. It was deep, guttural, distorted. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice wrapping around my mind like a vice. "You belong to me now." The mirror's glass began to shimmer, and I felt the world around me blur. My body felt heavy, as if I was being sucked into the mirror, pulled by an unseen force. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't move. My reflection's grip tightened, and I could feel its cold, suffocating presence taking over me. With a final, desperate cry, I tried to break free, but I felt myself falling into the mirror, into the reflection that had been waiting for me. Everything went dark. When I woke, I was lying on the floor of the attic, gasping for air. My heart was still racing, but the room was normal, quiet. The mirror stood in the corner, reflecting only the dim light from the window. But when I looked into it, I saw myself, just me, standing in front of the glass. I thought it was over. I thought I had escaped. But then I saw something in the corner of the mirror, a figure standing just behind me. And as I turned, the reflection remained. The grin, it was back,